Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Tuesday, September 12th, 2017. Support is building for single-payer Medicare for all health coverage in this country. Bernie Sanders will introduce a bill tomorrow in the Senate. John Conyers has record support in the House, but my old friend, the ultra-liberal Nancy Pelosi, is pragmatically saying, hold on. And here comes the split in the Democratic Party. So, as you know, polling shows that Democrats, people who identify as liberals, overwhelmingly support single payer. And let me define what I'm talking about because the terminology is important. Single payer means that the insurance companies are taken out of the health care system, and that instead, just like Medicare for seniors, the insurance and the payments to health providers comes from the government. This is not government takeover of health care, not the delivery of the services, simply the backroom payment for it. But of course, it'll be mischaracterized by both Democrats and Republicans as a takeover of health care, 1/6 of the economy being socialized. And that's all bullshit. We know it. So Bernie's 75-page bill will be introduced tomorrow, and his last attempts got 0 co-sponsors from fellow senators. But he already has Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, Sheldon Whitehouse, and Jeff Merkley, Democratic senators, on board. This is historic. Now, it is fair to say that similar to the Republican efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare, that there isn't any real political price for supporting single payer until the Democrats get into control of the Senate, control of the House, both, and eventually regain control of the White House. Obviously, we can't expect Trump and the Republicans to support single payer. But Democrats are afraid of strong aspirational leadership, setting goals and marching toward them. And this is where I have to chide my old friend Nancy Pelosi. As you may know, I've known Nancy since she first went to Congress in the 1980s. I did some work for her on a campaign back in 1996. And I still admire and I like Nancy personally. But this is another indication of why it's time for her to step down and allow new leadership to take on these huge challenges. I don't underestimate what it takes to shift to single payer. But Nancy Pelosi doesn't even want to try. And she doesn't want Democrats to make this a litmus test for who the good Dems are and who the bad Dems are going forward. And she's looking at the map from 2016. And she's saying, wow, there's so many Republican voters out there. They control the House. They now control the Senate. They got Trump past the Electoral College. And instead of being bold and doing what it takes to leapfrog over the cautious nature of past policies, Pelosi wants to hunker down with the cautious incrementalism that cost Hillary Clinton the election last year. And I've linked to a couple of interesting pieces. The New York Times' Margot Sanger-Katz has a good analytical piece. It tilts corporate. It tilts anti-single payer. And the Washington Post is the outlet that is reporting Pelosi's reluctance. But this is where Bernie Sanders understands the electorate, and Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton and other Democratic leaders don't. The calculus is that they need to win in red territory where government-funded health care is a much tougher sell. Well, that is the challenge. You've got to persuade people that their self-interest is better addressed by single payer, by Medicare for all, and by strengthening the Medicare system for all of us when we become eligible for it at 65. Those are sales that I believe can be made. And given the empty rhetoric of the Republicans, they have no way to replace or repeal Obamacare. They have not advanced a single useful idea except for people to pray that they don't get sick and for poor people to just say, well, I don't deserve health insurance, so I'll just have to accept that and move forward. And Sanger Katz in the Times talks about how the political resistance and the vulnerability of shifting to single-payer is a problem. She says nearly any single-payer plan would require substantial disruptions in the current health care system, upending the insurance arrangements of the 156 million Americans who get their coverage from work, changing the way doctors, hospitals, and drug companies are paid, and shifting more health care spending onto the government ledger. And when people have talked about state-level single-payer like California or Vermont, one of the big issues there is getting the federal government to buy in and allow Medicaid dollars to be shifted into a single-payer system. But I believe all of these goals are achievable. I think the obstacles can be overcome. We simply need to explain to people that it is in their self-interest and that the for-profit delivery of health care in this country is a complete and utter proven failure. And Pelosi says, well, I want to focus on protecting Obamacare. Well, I'm sorry, but I believe that is a lost cause. There are serious flaws in Obamacare, and the Republicans, led by Trump, are starving the machine. And they're going to make sure that it implodes. And even if you can make deals with Donald Trump over the debt ceiling and funding for hurricane relief, you're not going to achieve important progress by simply attempting to protect the status quo, which is the target of the Republicans. So I believe that my old pal Nancy Pelosi should retire, and one of the first things she ought to do is read Hillary Clinton's new book. It's called What Happened? And Nancy Pelosi is a very sharp, shrewd political creature. When we talk about her being pragmatic, she refers to it as being reptilian, cold-blooded. You just have to calculate what is going to work politically and what is not. And I believe that that pragmatic thinking is very Clinton-esque, and it led to really the disruption of the Democratic Party. And there are those who say, I see it on Facebook every day, Sanders should go away and shut up. He's not even a Democrat. Well, Bernie Sanders has attempted to save the Democratic Party from itself. And old-school guardians like Pelosi and Hillary Clinton, they really need to get out of the way. Now, there are a couple of reviews that I've linked to in the show file for the podcast. Jennifer Senior at the New York Times reviews Hillary's new book. And she has some funny lines here. She says, it's a rant against James B. Comey, Bernie Sanders, the media, James B. Comey, Vladimir Putin, and James B. Comey. It is a primer on Russian spying, although the reviews I've read indicate that Hillary is not using that as a major excuse for her loss last year. Continuing here from the Times, what happened is wearying, canned, and disingenuous, spinning events like a top. Does it offer any new hypotheses about what doomed Clinton's campaign? No. It merely synthesizes old ones. Is there a full chapter devoted to her email, clearly intended to make her own closing arguments in the case? Yes. A little bit later, Senior writes, it's a grim reminder of the worst we've read about Clinton. She needs a separate storage unit to hold her grudges and her sets of tiny knives. She believes that voter suppression in swing states, made possible by a ruling of the Supreme Court in 2013, also made a difference. Well, that's refreshing, because I hammered that last year. Democrats didn't listen. Greg Palast went to great lengths to explain the interstate cross-check list to Democratic leaders. They shunned him. And in the post-election period, Hillary Clinton did not lift a finger to challenge the chicanery mostly imposed by Republicans on last year's electoral process. My friend who owes me $5 for his wager that Hillary Clinton would win last November, Thomas Frank, has a review of sorts and commentary of the new book in The Guardian today. And he's got some choice lines, too. Her new book is less an effort to explain than it is to explain away. No real blame ever settles anywhere near Clinton's person. While she wrestles gamely with the larger historical questions of why the party of the people has withered as inequality grows, she never offers a satisfying answer. Readers can find clues to the mystery of 2016 here and there among the clouds of blame evasion and positive thinking. Why did she run? Quote, because I thought I'd be good at the job. It was a chance to do the most good I would ever be able to do. Later, Frank says she seems to have been almost totally unprepared for the outburst of populist anger that characterized last year, an outburst that came under half a dozen different guises: trade, outsourcing, immigration, opiates, deindustrialization, and the recent spectacle of Wall Street criminals getting bailed out. It wasn't the issues that mattered so much as the outrage, and Donald Trump put himself in front of it. Clinton couldn't. When she isn't repeating self-help bromides or demonizing the Russians, she can be found wondering why so many working-class people have deserted the Democratic Party. And a couple of more quotes here. She only writes about trade, for example, in the most general terms. NAFTA and the TPP, never. Her husband's program of bank deregulation is photoshopped out. The names Goldman Sachs and Walmart never come up. So it is a very selective look at Hillary's POV. I've asked for a copy of the book from the publisher. I've asked for an interview with the former Secretary of State. I won't be surprised if they send the book. I will be surprised if they schedule the interview. And one thing, as Philip Bump points out in today's Washington Post, Hillary Clinton does correctly blame the media for all that free and generally uncritical attention they gave to Donald Trump. Now, when I say uncritical, they did allow a lot of his cringe-worthy and cringe-inducing tweets and comments to be broadcast. But they really laid off of him, and every one of us can remember on a night when Bernie Sanders won, say, the Indiana primary, the networks didn't let Bernie speak. He spoke to a crowd, but not to the networks. They showed the podium of Donald Trump, who gamed it out, and he waited till Bernie finished speaking before he appeared, and the media went along with that. Now, Hillary also makes the claim that the media gave 3 times as much coverage to her emails as they did to Trump's negatives. And that's a selective figure. It's really based on the imbalance that Fox gave to critical coverage of Hillary and her emails. And, of course, those are all self-inflicted wounds, which Hillary seems to think just came from somewhere else. Bob Perry has done it again. At Consortium News today, he dissects the front-page article from Friday's New York Times, written by Scott Shane. The article was headlined, "To Sway Vote, Russia Used Army of Fake Americans." Flooding Twitter and Facebook, imposters helped fuel anger in polarized U.S. And Perry, who has taught journalism, applies that mindset to fact-checking and criticizing Scott Shane's piece. And he gets a well-deserved F for journalism. Because, for example, Shane cites a guy named Melvin Reddick, who appears to be fake, and who suggested on June 8th of last year that people visit D.C. leaks, which Shane says is factually, not an allegation, that these emails were stolen by Russian hackers. And Bob Perry also brings a little shame to Scott Shane by quoting his earlier skepticism about the January 6th CIA intel report. Shane, who covered that, the release of that, wrote at the time, "What is missing from the public report is what many Americans most eagerly anticipated, hard evidence to back up the claims that the Russian government engineered the election attack. Instead, the message from the agencies essentially amounts to trust us." Well, Scott Shane's come a long way since January. He's got a lot of trust in the leaks, the anonymous sources, and the what I consider to be unproven fables that have been written. And the army that is talked about is less than 500 identities. Some of those may have been fakes. Some of them may have been bots or duplicates. But as Parry points out, there are 2 billion users on Facebook. And the $100,000 in ads that we're told a Russian company placed in indirect support of Trump, well, it pales in comparison to the $85 million the Trump campaign spent on Facebook and the $27 billion in revenue that Facebook earned last year. So I think this is a must-read. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast, and I hope you will check out Bob Perry's latest critique of the bad reporting of the New York Times. And here's more jaundiced, biased reporting. This comes from Vice News. Headline reads, FBI wants to know if Russia's Sputnik is Kremlin propaganda. And here's their opening paragraph. If you set up an office in Washington on behalf of a foreign government and dedicate yourself to bending American public opinion to serve the interest of that country's foreign policy, you're more than likely a propaganda outlet. Now, that's a kind of Fox News omniscient statement. It's not grounded in anything in particular. It's just one of these kind of free associative indictments. The next paragraph reads, the FBI has launched an investigation into whether Russian state-controlled media outlet Sputnik may be effectively acting as an undeclared propaganda wing of the Kremlin. If so, it may be violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Now, that's a fair question. But nobody has raised those questions about Al Jazeera. It spent millions, if not a couple of billion, launching its American news service, and it clearly had a point of view. And so Sputnik is not secret, it's not undercover, it doesn't pretend to be American when it's Russian. And there are many Americans like Ed Schultz, Brad Friedman, and respected international journalists like Pepe Escobar who do get paid by Sputnik. And I think it's up to listeners and viewers to determine whether a particular story is propaganda or not. But this is a kind of McCarthy-esque measure. This coverage smacks of that kind of smear job. And what I'm seeing here is we're able to come up with some interesting perceptions about these so-called alternative media outlets like Vice and BuzzFeed when they join the chorus of the corporate mainstream media in this country. And at BuzzFeed today, John Hudson writes with shock and horror that he has received a secret document that was written in the Kremlin, approved by Vladimir Putin, delivered to the Trump administration earlier this year. And this dangerous document called for the wholesale restoration of diplomatic, military, and intelligence channels severed between Russia and the United States following the military interventions by Russia in, well, this is their language, in Ukraine and Syria. And this, of course, is something that I have no fear about. But the Washington establishment and Steve Bannon said that the reason that Republicans want to nullify the 2016 election and limit Donald Trump's scope in foreign policy relates to this Russophobia. Now, I don't want to be all chummy with Russia, and, it's not like I think that Vladimir Putin is a great guy and he's never had anybody executed. But we have to be realistic. We have to be pragmatic, friends. And to write this kind of hysterical piece, I've linked to it. You can check the tone for yourselves. The alarm that is sounded because we might normalize relations with Russia, in general, I think that would be a very good thing. The article reads in part, officials at the White House and State Department declined to say who delivered the document but did not dispute its authenticity. They denied giving the Russians explicit indications that their proposal was feasible. When asked how Moscow got the impression that its terms might be acceptable, a spokesperson for the National Security Council cited misleading news reports about Trump's infatuation with Russia. Frankly, I would point more to media coverage than to administration overtures. And so this is what has infected our media and our political structure in the United States here in 2017. And it's really off base. And I guess here I have to insert a little caveat that I don't support Trump. I think he's a dangerous guy in the White House. But he's there, and we've got to deal with it. And using the deep state to neutralize him is a big mistake. Every day I like to pause for a minute and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your voluntary subscriptions. People like Jim McHugh, Bill Goodacre, Mona Kobus, and David Levine. They each kick in $5 a month. I mean, that's what some people spend on a cup of coffee just before lunch. I invite you to support it, too. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. That takes you to the sign-up page, and in just a couple of minutes, you can make a choice on the level of support that's comfortable for you. I couldn't do this without your help, and I want to single out Terry Paris, who I got to meet in Oakland last night at the 9/11 Film Festival. She is a stalwart supporter of my work, and I really do appreciate it. Today, I'm releasing a fresh interview at peterbcollins.com with journalist Tim Shorrock. We covered his report last week at Alternet, and he pulls back the curtain on the collusion between the Obama administration and the CIA with Sony Pictures when they inserted propaganda and edited a film called The Interview starring Seth Rogen, and this was released back in 2014, just in the same season as the hack of the computer systems at Sony Pictures. And what Shorrock explains is that the Rand Corporation's so-called expert on North Korea, Bruce Bennett, was consulted on the ending of the film where Kim Jong-un is assassinated by two American stoners, played by Rogen and his co-star. And what's fascinating about this is that the studio actively sought to get advice and basically ceded control over its film to government officials who were hoping that the interview, or at least some excerpts of it, would make their way into North Korea in a far-fetched scheme to bring down the government of Kim Jong-un. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Tim Shorrock.
Well, I think it's insidious in part because a lot, the public doesn't know about this. They see these films, and unless they read investigative reporting, they don't know that CIA might have been consulted or Defense Department, whatever. But I mean, Hollywood makes tons of movies, where they get the cooperation of the U.S. military, and of course, the U.S. military is not going to get involved unless it's portrayed in a positive way. And so, or the same goes for intelligence. And so, Zero Dark 30, they depicted the way torture was done,
right?
And but they consulted closely with the CIA, and that was actually investigated by Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, you have more of a relationship with the Department of Defense as well as State Department. But according to Rogan, he was being he was talking about the film with somebody he said he thought was in the CIA, who probably was in the CIA. So he was getting information from them, while they were doing it.
I hope you'll listen to the full interview with Tim Shorrock. He explains how Seth Rogen has gone ballistic on Twitter since the report appeared last week, and that, Sony Pictures lost a bundle of money on this propaganda piece called The Interview. Shorrock also comments on the development last night that the UN Security Council did approve the watered-down sanctions that have been proposed by the Trump administration against North Korea, and it will reduce oil imports and some exports from North Korea. I also asked Tim Shorrock if he believes the U.S. no longer has nuclear missiles or nuclear weapons in South Korea. He thinks that's the case, but also says that there are plenty of submarines and ships and bombers that have nuclear weapons that can reach North Korea on a pretty short notice. Now, I was slamming Vice News a minute ago, so let me say something nice about them. They did a great job today in publishing the first database that tracks America's criminal cops. And this is put together by a man named Phil Stinson, a former cop and an attorney, who, with some law school grads, were wondering, gosh, how many cops get accused of and convicted of crimes every year? I've linked to the report in the show file for the podcast. Some highlights? Well, the data covers a small segment, 2,800 or about 3,000 of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. It covers a time period of 2005 to 2012. There were 8,000 arrest incidents, resulting in 13,000 charges against 6,600 police officers. And the biggest year for crime by cops in recent times is 2011. About 100,000 officer arrests occur per year. And the most common crimes include assault, driving under the influence, official misconduct, aggravated assault, and forcible fondling. About 1,200 of the cops were arrested for sex-related crimes during the time period. More than half of the alleged victims were underage. I mentioned forcible fondling, but also forcible rape is these are the most common sex crimes. Also, 846 were arrested for drug-related offenses. 227 of those involved more than one drug, and there were over 1,000 cases of official misconduct. The most arrests occur with rookies. Those are just highlights from the data set. Take a look. I think it's a good start at trying to quantify the level of crime by men and women who wear a uniform and a badge and carry a gun every day. Jeff Sessions wants to roll in the polygraph to the White House and the National Security Council to try to track down leakers of the past and to intimidate future leakers. His idea is to do a one-time, one-issue polygraph test of everyone on the NSC and ask them who leaked the president's phone calls with the Prime Minister of Australia and the President of Mexico. As you may know, the polygraph is not that reliable, and in 2 years ago, a federal jury awarded $4 million to 9 former translators at the Drug Enforcement Agency who were required to undergo illegal lie detector tests. Well, as I mentioned last night, I attended and introduced a few films at the annual 9/11 Truth Film Festival in Oakland. I want to thank the organizers, Ken and Carol, and all sorts of people who are always welcoming me there and who really are fighting for the truth. A couple of interesting developments of Bill Pepper, the respected attorney for the family of Martin Luther King, who represented James Earl Ray, the alleged sole assassin of King, and who now represents Sirhan Sirhan, the alleged assassin of Robert F. Kennedy. These are important cases that form the long arc of state crimes against democracy. And Bill Pepper was fascinating. Also, I introduced a film, the latest from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, with features. It features a former employee of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the agency that was used to whitewash and put out phony science about the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings in New York, including Building 7. And Peter Michael Ketchum, the former NIST employee, is very compelling. You can feel his own inner anger at the way he participated in a cover-up. And he flatly says that the claims that the buildings that came down in free fall, the 200-story towers and the 46-story Building 7, that the explanations are Rube Goldberg And if that reference is too aged for you, Rube Goldberg was a cartoonist who used to make these contraptions that complicated simple tasks. And that's how Mr. Ketchum characterized the NIST study that concluded that Building 7 came down just because of some fires that were burning on just a couple of floors. It's preposterous. And anybody who is intellectually honest will acknowledge that. Also, through my Facebook friends, I was linked to a commentary by a sociology professor from Massachusetts and a 9/11 skeptic. His name is Edward Curtin. And I'm linking to his piece because he, from the get-go, from watching the live coverage on September 11th, 2001, was very suspicious and skeptical. And with the work of David Ray Griffin and others, he came to the conclusion that a process of linguistic mind control was in place before, during, and after the attacks. As with all good propaganda, the language had to be insinuated over time, introduced through intermediaries, and then it had to be repeated over and over again. And he singles out a number of phrases, like Pearl Harbor. And that, of course, became the part of the title of David Ray Griffin's book, New Pearl Harbor. Also, the introduction of the term homeland. I have always cringed. I hate that word. It is vaguely Germanic. It is not American. And it was just inserted by the Bush administration when they formed the Department of Domestic Security and called it Homeland Security. Also, the use of the term Ground Zero, which is a nuclear weapons term that came out of World War II, and the term 9/11 itself. He said this is the key usage that has reverberated down the years, around which others revolve. It is an anomalous numerical designation applied to an historical event, and obviously also the emergency telephone number. Try to think of another numerical appellation for an important event in American history. The linkage of the attacks to a permanent national emergency was thus subliminally introduced. There's more in his article, and I've linked to it. I hope you'll click on it and read it. And finally today, Naomi Klein, who has joined The Intercept, is doing some great work there. And she warns that people who believe in climate change, who think that Irma and Harvey and wildfires in California and other extreme weather events are going to cause Republicans to wake up and change their minds about climate change, well, she says, forget about it. Says, now, I've written about how these kinds of disasters are used for disaster capitalism, the shock doctrine. She says that Trump's timing of talking about tax cuts during the hurricanes, she says that it's even more revealing for what it shows about what's driving climate change denial. It's not a rejection of the science, but a rejection of the consequences of the science. Put simply, if the science is true, then the whole economic project that has dominated American power structure since Reagan was president is out the window, and the deniers know it. Here's what we need to understand in a hurry, writes Klein. Climate change can only be dealt with through collective action that sharply curtails the behavior of ExxonMobil and Goldman Sachs. Climate change demands investments in the public sphere, in new energy grids, public transit, light rail, energy efficiency, on a scale that we haven't seen since World War II. And that can only happen by raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations, the very people Trump is determined to shower with the most generous tax cuts, loopholes, and regulatory breaks. In short, climate change detonates the ideological scaffolding on which contemporary conservatism rests. Well said, Naomi. Very well said. Thanks for listening to my News and Comment podcast. It's available every day on YouTube, and I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until